before Alpha, I grew up in a Christian family. When I was about 16, 17 years old, I kind of unceremoniously walked away from the church.
I'd say that I was an atheist because I would go out of my way to make sure that the people that believed in a higher power, that they were stupid and they didn't know what they were talking about and they believed in fairy tales.
So I pretty much left all organized religion and wanted nothing to do with it.
So I didn't really know too much about God, didn't know how to have a relationship with Him. The only thing I knew about God was how to ask Him for things.
Anyone mentioning the name Jesus just almost made the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
For the first launch dinner, I was really, really nervous. It felt really comfortable. It felt really natural and really genuine being around everyone.
And I was like, I can't believe I'm walking into this place. This is so crazy. Like, oh, you can get through this one dinner, Jeremiah. You can get through this one dinner. You can do it.
I felt complete anonymity. It was really cool because I could ask anything and not feel like I was being judged for my questions, and like there was no holds barred, like I could ask anything.
My group was so much fun. I really confided in them a lot, and it's crazy because it happened within a few weeks of just knowing them, but it feels like I've known them for a long time.
I was luckily in an amazing group of people, very diverse, different levels and walks of life.
I fully expected too, when I asked certain questions, to get these pat answers from the guy that was leading the group, and that didn't happen. And what happened was there's dialogue started amongst other people in the group, and more questions were coming, and we were really being real with each other.
Other people had the same questions, and it was completely okay to ask these questions. It wasn't like, you should know this by now.
My life with Jesus since Alpha is very different. Life is good, life is sweet, life is joyful.
It's hard to articulate sometimes without getting emotional, because I feel like I'm on a journey now with Christ that I didn't have.
I'm excited and I'm happy and I walk around with purpose and I look forward to a future.
It's life-changing. I mean, it really is.
It's so non-judgmental and it's so approachable. I mean, you can come as you are. You know, show up and check it out.
Well, welcome to North Shore. It is so good to see all of you joining us in this room, and those of you who may be joining us online. We're so glad you're connecting in with us today. The stories you just heard are real stories from real people who've gone through this experience called Alpha. It's this multi-week experience that includes dinner, lots of conversation, lots of time for questions. It is the single best environment I know in our day if you have questions about life or faith or the meaning of life, to be able to wrestle with those, no judging, no strings attached. So here's my challenge to you, North Shore. I think every person listening right now has at least one person in their life who's got questions, struggles, trying to figure out how to make sense of their life, and you have enough relational equity to ask that person or say to that person, hey, there's an experience in my church that's all about asking questions about life and faith. Will you come with me? It's next Sunday night, September 22nd. If it's not a great experience, you don't have to come back. No one's going to call you or bother you or hassle you. But here's the thing, North Shore. Last Sunday morning at church, 3 people professed faith in Jesus for the first time because of their experience in Alpha. And that happened because somebody invited them. So I just want to challenge you, encourage you to pray about it, think about it. You can find out more at northshore.church/alpha, or just text right now, try Alpha to 97000. We can get you all the information you need. It's worth it, it's worth it, it's worth it. Take a risk and make an invitation. It could change somebody's life. Well, you've picked a great weekend to be with us here at North Shore because we're diving into this series called Together For. These 2 critical words in our vision statement that says we are a church together for our neighbors, the next generation, and those in need so that the Puget Sound and beyond can flourish. Last weekend, we celebrated 50 years of North Shore history. We talked about how much has changed in church life and in this church over time. Ministry programs have changed. Music styles have changed. Attention spans have changed. When I was growing up, sermons went for like an hour. I've lost some of you already, right now. How we do church is always changing, but why we do church at North Shore has remained the same. We are here to lead people into a life-changing relationship with Jesus because Jesus can change everything for anyone. That's the why. But there's something else that's been consistent throughout the years here at North Shore, and it's how we answer the question, for whom does North Shore exist? For whom does North Shore exist? Who are we trying to reach? Now, who are we focusing on so that Jesus can change more and more lives? Well, if you look through the Bible, there are these three great themes that appear over and over in terms of who God called his people to be for. Their neighbors, the next generation, and those in need. In fact, you can hardly find a chapter or story in the Bible where God's heart for those around you, or God's heart for those coming up behind you, or God's heart for those in need of mercy or help or healing or justice isn't absolutely clear. So for these next few weeks, we're going to unpack what it looks like, what it means for us as a church family to be a church for our neighbors, and a church for the next generation, and a church for those in need, because this is going to shape everything that we do. So I'm so glad that you're with us this weekend. And to help make this more personal and more practical for each of you, we've created a tool that you can use during the series. I'll be using it with each message in the series. This Together For booklet, which you found on your chair. There's one for you online. You could download from our website if you're online. It's a simple, practical guide for how you can take a next step with Jesus in being together for. Starting with, if you open kind of past the first page, starting with our neighbors, which is what I want to talk about with you today. A few years ago, I read an amazing book called The Art of Neighboring. The Art of Neighboring by these two pastors named Dave Runyon and Jay Pathak. And in the book, they tell this story about going to meet with the mayor of their city with a group of local pastors. And they asked their mayor the question, how can we churches, how can your churches of your city best work together to serve the city? And the mayor went on to name a number of social problems, at-risk kids and rundown housing and drug and alcohol abuse. Most people, he said, try to solve these problems with programs, and programs are good. But he said, you know what seems to be more effective than programs? Relationships. Because you see, when people are in relationship with each other, the elderly shut-in gets visited, and that at-risk kid gets mentored, and the house in disrepair gets updated. And then the mayor said something that none of those pastors was expecting. He said, the majority of the issues our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just figure out a way to become a community of great neighbors. And after the meeting, the pastors just sat and stared at each other in sort of a stunned silence until one said, is it just me, or did the mayor of our city just tell a group of pastors that our city needs us to do what Jesus told us to do? That is, we need to love our neighbors. Could it really be that simple? Well, according to Jesus, yes, it is actually just that simple. Let me show you what I mean. One time, Jesus was approached by a group of religious leaders. Many of you know the story. One of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. He said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And by the way, in that day, there was only one right answer to this question. And every devout rabbi in that day would know it. It's the text the Israelites called the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for to hear or to listen. The Shema is found in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. It says this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." Now, in that day, a devout Jew would pray this prayer twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. It was the first prayer, the first text that a child would learn in their life. This text was the centerpiece of the life and faith of a Jewish person in that day. So when Jesus answered the expert in the law by saying these words, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, this is the first and greatest commandment," the expert would have said, "Okay, Yeah, that's right. I've heard some funny stories about you, Jesus, some not so sure things about you, Jesus, but that's the right answer. It's the only right answer in the day. Jesus, you've passed the test. But just as that expert in the law was probably walking away, Jesus continued with the words, and the second is like it. Wait, pause, stop. Second? What do you mean second? When it comes to the Shema, there is no second, there's no rival, there's no equal, there's nothing that compares to this one text. Jesus continued, and the second is like it. Get this, love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus said words that would have been almost unthinkable. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. See, with Jesus, the greatest commandment, it's no longer just one, it's two. And his audience in that moment would have been astonished, speechless. Not because loving one's neighbor was a foreign or strange idea. This command was deeply rooted in the Old Testament and in first century life. It was because Jesus was putting these two commands, loving God and loving neighbor, side by side as equals. As if to say, if you love God, you'll love your neighbor. And as if to say, if you don't love your neighbor, well, you actually don't love God. Now, at first glance, this sort of revised, updated greatest commandment, to me, seems a little bit anticlimactic. I mean, if you're going to modify the greatest commandment, Jesus, do it in a way that grabs people's attention, right? Love God and plant 10,000 churches. Love God and end global hunger. Love God and put a stop to political corruption. But Jesus, love God and love your neighbor? I mean, that's just so ordinary, so mundane, so un-Instagrammable, like so uninteresting. But what if the very heart of following Jesus was actually just this simple? What if this one command was the one thing that could change the world as we know it, if only every follower of Jesus would actually do it? And here's the thing, the early church seemed to think so. They took this really seriously. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who actually wrote most of our New Testament, once put it this way. He said, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself." Paul was an expert in the law as well. He knew the entire law. The entire law summed up in this one thing, really? So, to be a church for our neighbors, we have to, it's not meant to be a trick question, we have to love our neighbors, right? Not just be polite to our neighbors, not just tolerate our neighbors, not just evaluate our neighbors, which, by the way, we do all the time, don't we? I mean, can you believe how they parent? Or can you believe they're living together? Jesus never once said, work hard to keep up with your neighbors or drive the same car as your neighbor or get your kids into the same college as your neighbor. He doesn't even say, convert your neighbor. And not because Jesus doesn't want them to know God, but because he knows the only way you can discover a God of love is to have a tangible experience of love, which is why Jesus said, love your neighbor. And here's the thing. Every one of us has neighbors, don't we? Regardless of your age, stage, situation in life, they're the people on your street, the people on the floor of your dorm or your apartment building, people in your office or your classroom. The challenge, you see, isn't having a neighbor, it's actually loving your neighbor. And by the way, in the Bible, the word love has different meaning, different connotations than we often use in our day. Love is not about having warm feelings or polite affection or just saying to people stuff they want to hear. Love means to seek the good of another person, as God defines good. To actually seek the good of another person. That takes time, investment, energy, priorities. It means investing and forgiving and caring. So question, how's that going in your life? How's the love of neighbor, the great and greatest commandment, going? You know, back to that story when that group of pastors met with their neighbor, they got some surprising and maybe not so great feedback about churches in their community. One of the city managers actually told them, from the city's perspective, there isn't a noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our community. In other words, Christians may look different in terms of church attendance or knowledge of the Bible or personal devotional practices or family values, but when it comes to being neighbors, when it comes to the most important thing, the greatest commandment that Jesus gave them to live, in that city at least, there wasn't a noticeable difference in how people who claimed to follow Jesus and people who didn't actually lived around neighboring. And I just have to be the first to confess, in my life, I have been part of this problem. Years ago, when I first became a pastor, I moved into this little house near the church where I was serving, and even though I was a pastor, I didn't really consider the people on my street part of my ministry. So I tried to be friendly with my neighbors and polite to my neighbors, but I never really invested and tried to make friends with my neighbors. In fact, when Nina and I got married, I remember her saying, "So tell me about our neighbors." And this is just so embarrassing, I really couldn't do it. I said things like, that family in that house has 2 kids, maybe 3, I don't really know. The guy in that house drives a motorcycle, but I forget his name. There's an elderly woman who gets cared for in that home, but I've never met her, I've never visited. I had lived there for years. For years, I lived there. And by the way, don't look at me that way. I said I was a pastor, not a good pastor, okay? I'm just trying to be honest here, okay? And here's the thing, I always had my reasons, and to me they felt like good reasons. It was because I was so busy, I was working at a growing church, there was a lot to do. It was often because I was tired at the end of the day, and so I'd come home and I didn't want to be social around the street. And in many ways I was relationally saturated, I had good friends, people I was investing in, people I wanted to do life with. Those were all the excuses I made, the reasons I felt justified for being polite to my neighbors, and I was, but never really getting to know their stories. Never really getting involved in their lives, never actually loving them. And by the way, looking back, I don't just see this as embarrassing or antisocial. I see this as sinful. I wasn't doing something Jesus said not to do, but I was not doing something Jesus said is actually the most important thing to do. And here's the thing, I know a lot of sincere and well-intentioned, church-going followers of Jesus who can get caught in this same trap. We get so busy. Our schedules get full. We have other priorities, pressing needs around us. We let our driveways and our fences keep our lives safe, separate, comfortable, secure. And then we settle for what I would call polite but often superficial encounters with our neighbors. But here's the thing, Jesus said, if you love God, you won't just be polite to your neighbor. You won't just have a passing encounter here and there with your neighbor and smile and wave. You will love your neighbor. So our question's real simple today. How do we do that? How do we do that as a church and in our lives? Well, in that book, The Art of Neighboring, the writers give a simple framework that I have found quite helpful in my life. They say loving your neighbor means moving simply from stranger to acquaintance to relationship. To love your neighbor, you've got to move from stranger to acquaintance to relationship. So I thought right now we could pause and just do a little self-assessment on this front. It's good. Self-assessment's kind of good for the soul. So everybody get out your Together For booklet, if you would. We're going to use these every week, so try to hold on to these. And a few pages in, there's a chart with empty houses on it that looks something like this. Chart with empty houses. Everyone find it or is finding it? We're going to do a little assessment right now on how well we actually know our neighbors. So those empty houses are actually the houses or apartments or condos or rooms right around where you live. So what we're going to do is you're going to take a moment and write down the names of the neighbors that you actually know. If it's 1, 2, 3, all of them, write down their names. And if possible, write down something personal you know about them. Could be their career, something about their family, what they enjoy. And by the way, the creators of this chart call this the chart of shame. Because it's going to be a little painful. So neighbors, something you know, we're going to get going. We have some music for you to help you go. 1, 2, 3, let's do it. Okay, I can tell some of you finished real quick, so I'm going to come back and kind of rescue you a little bit. How'd that go? Kind of painful, right, for some of us? I went through this chart this week, couldn't fill it out, couldn't complete it. It's called the chart of shame for a reason, and it's because almost everybody fails. In fact, in the hundreds of churches that have done this exercise, only about 10% of people can fill out all of their neighbors' names. And less than 1% actually know something personal about all their neighbors. Less than 1%. Now, the point is not to shame you or make you feel bad or make you want to compare yourself with your neighbor in the room. The point is to let the sting of this chart motivate you to action. And here's the good news. To move from stranger to acquaintance, you don't have to read a book or attend a class. You just have to knock on your neighbor's door. It's actually just that simple. You can do it this week. You can knock on your neighbor's door. Although I know this can feel risky, right? Because you don't always know how people will respond. This past year, someone actually knocked on my door. They were raising money for some kind of a nonprofit, and Nina was gone, and Nora was crying, and I was tired from a long day at work, and I was kind of short with that person. You know, I told them, I'm sorry, it's not a good time. I've had a long day. I've been really busy. I can't help you. I'm really worn out. And they said, oh, well, wait, what do you do for a living? And that was kind of a Holy Spirit convicting moment for me. So I told them I'm a pastor at that Presbyterian church down the road. So I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. Knocking on a neighbor's door, that's just the first step. And it can be a risky thing, but that's how you move from a stranger to acquaintance. And the next step, moving from acquaintance to relationship, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible about how to do this. Proverbs 3:28 says this, do not say to your neighbor, come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you when you have it with you already. In other words, if your neighbor needs something and you have it, loan it to him. And this works both ways. If you need something, don't just rush off to the store first thought. Actually go and knock on a door and ask to borrow it from your neighbor. Another proverb says this, it's a sin to despise one's neighbor, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. Neighbors are kind to each other, even when there's a need. And there's so many ways you can actually practice this in your street or your community, in your dorm or your office. Take someone out to coffee. Help someone with a home improvement project. Hang out in your front yard instead of your backyard. Offer to pick up somebody's groceries. Start a book club. Invite someone to do something that you enjoy doing. Host a block party. Just get the people in your neighborhood together. Mentor a kid on your street. There's actually a kid on my street who always comes outside whenever he sees me outside. Like he's always right there. Every time I take out the trash or walk the dog, he comes running across the street to play or ask a question. I kid you not, I have literally tried to sneak outside without being noticed, and just when I think the coast is clear, he's right there. He's like the Holy Spirit, but 3 feet tall and on a bicycle. It's wild. But here's the thing, part of loving my neighbor is hanging out with my neighbor's son. Here's one of my favorite instructions on neighboring from the book of Leviticus. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly. How many of you are excited to see that in the Bible? Like you've been preparing a neighbor rebuke for months and you're ready to give it to him, right? By the way, this doesn't mean pronounce judgment on your neighbor. It means to be honest about conflict or disagreements, because how often does a little thing, something happens or some noise or something on somebody's lawn or the way they park their car, this little thing over time becomes a big thing that roots all this bitterness in you. So have a conversation, be honest, love and forgive when necessary. And of course, if you really want to learn to neighbor well, look at what Jesus was doing when he wasn't teaching or healing. Just go through and look at what he was doing. He was always sharing a meal, or he was at a party or dinner. He was attending a wedding. You see, following Jesus means more meals, more dinners, more block parties, more hanging out, more deep conversations. And I know the extroverts in the room, you're getting more and more excited about this church. You introverts, you're feeling like, I'm going to have to find a new church. I can't even do this. But here's the thing. Jesus told us to do this. Jesus modeled this for us in his life. This is actually how churches are supposed to grow. It's the most simple but brilliant church growth strategy the world has ever known. And by the way, you may not know this, but when North Shore was started 50 years ago, this is how it grew. They didn't wait for people to come and find them. They actually went to their neighbors. In fact, over 2,000 visits were made in the very first year of this church just to neighbors. 2,000 visits from just a handful of people. Now, to be clear, as we think about this, and if you think about this in your life and think about what you could do, what your next step may be, just remember your neighbor is not a project, okay? Your neighbor is not your project. Jesus doesn't say, go and try to fix your neighbor, do a spiritual assessment of your neighbor. He says, love them. And loving them means don't lead with, hey, I've noticed some sin in your life. I'd love to sit down over dinner and talk to you about that. Loving means listening. Loving means getting to know their story. Loving means coming to understand the context in which they live. Loving means being vulnerable about your own story, your own struggles. Sometimes loving means giving them space when they need space. Some of your neighbors are busy, they're more introverted, they're not interested. I love how the writer of Proverbs 25 describes this. He says, seldom set foot in your neighbor's house. Too much of you and they will hate you. I mean, clearly this writer had like a really annoying neighbor, right? Like he was fed up, he was tired of it, and now we get to read about it in the Bible, all right? Neighbors are not projects. They're people. And relationships with people aren't built overnight. It takes time. It takes initiative. It takes genuine care. It takes seeking to understand someone who may be different than you. And by the way, when people are different from you, whether that's ethnically or culturally or spiritually, it's easy to let our differences create a wall of presumption, a wall of assessment or assumptions we make. It's easy to assume things that aren't true. And it's easy at the end of the day to maybe keep your distance or just kind of write that person off. But here's the thing about love. Love doesn't assume. Love doesn't keep its distance. Love doesn't write people off. Think of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And that day, if you know the story, she was the wrong gender, the wrong race, the wrong lifestyle. But to Jesus, she was a person with a story. Think of Jesus and the Roman centurion who came to Jesus asking for help. In that day, Roman guards, Roman soldiers were like the sworn enemy of Israel. And yet Jesus healed this man's servant and praised his faith. To Jesus, he was a person with a story. Think of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Tax collectors in that day, they were hated by everybody. But to Jesus, Zacchaeus was a person with a story. And what did Jesus do? He said, Zacchaeus, I'm coming over to your house for dinner tonight. In other words, he knocked on his door. And that knock on Zacchaeus' door changed his life forever. Kind of makes me think of those amazing words Jesus said when he said, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. The image here is of Jesus, the God of the universe, being willing to leave the comfort of his house and come knocking on the door of yours. That's how it works, friends. That's how God moves. That's how God changes life. One door to the next. And by the way, just think of what could happen if followers of Jesus in our day lived this way. Think of what would happen if just North Shore, just our church here, if we lived this way. Think back to that chart of shame. Think back to that roadmap view. If each of those houses around yours averaged just 3 people, that would mean every home at North Shore has 24 neighbors. Now let's do some math here. Since there are around 2,000 of these homes in the North Shore family, that means 48,000 people could be blessed, could be known, could be loved, all by this one church family. 48,000 people. So the chart of shame, by the way, that's your homework. That's your assignment this week, is to take it home, fill it out. If you don't know it, spend these next few weeks working to fill it out, moving from stranger to acquaintance to relationship. Why? Because Jesus said, it kind of boils down to this one thing. Love your neighbor. And by the way, that chart of shame, it's actually the chart of hope if you think about it. You see, it's God's simple but brilliant plan to help us become who we're supposed to be and to help our neighborhoods become what they were intended to be. But you have to be willing to leave the comfort of your house and go knocking on the door of someone else's, because who knows what God might do. This past spring, a former reporter for ABC News named Peggy Waymeyer published an autobiographical story in the Washington Post about how she learned about the power of loving your neighbor. And I just want to close by reading her story, her words to you. She says, whenever I wonder what it will take to stop us from attacking our adversaries, I think back to my first experience of hating my neighbor. I was 27 when I landed an early morning anchor job at the ABC News affiliate in Dallas. Each weekday, I set my alarm for 2:30 a.m., showered, put on makeup, dressed as though I was competing in a fashion show. Then I jumped into the driver's seat of my blue Honda Accord and sped south down the highway. The biggest impediment to my success as a morning news anchor wasn't the hours, my wardrobe, or my on-air delivery. It was the enemy next door. My next-door neighbor had a Yorkshire Terrier that barked incessantly in the evenings, running along the chain-link fence outside of my bedroom window. I asked my neighbor to please take her dog inside for the night. She ignored my request, and my resentment boiled like hot lava. I lay in bed at night listening to the dog's shrill bark and imagined all the ways I could silence it. It wasn't pretty. I began to fantasize about lacing a juicy steak with poison and dropping over the fence, and my dark passion caught me by surprise. Who was I becoming? This woman who sang in church on Sundays and on Mondays dreamed up ways to hurt her neighbor's pet. Instead of silencing the Yorkie, my husband and I filed a noise complaint with the city. The court set a hearing date for December 24th. My neighbor, in retaliation, baited a trap on her property with cat food, lured my tabby over the fence, and sent him to the pound. As Christmas approached, I had to choose which voice would control my next move: the contemptuous one that had demonized a neighbor, or the empathic and self-sacrificing one that was being seriously tested. I walked reluctantly across the driveway dividing our houses, climbed up those front steps, and knocked on her door. My neighbor faced me with a steely grimace. "What do you want?" she asked. "I came to apologize," I said. "I'm sorry I've ramped up this conflict by taking you to court on Christmas Eve. I don't want to fight anymore. And by the way, if there's anything I can do to be a better neighbor, I hope you'll let me know." To surrender my peaceful night's sleep left me feeling powerless, even humiliated. But as I watched the surprise register on my neighbor's face, something else happened in me. I felt lighter, freer, released from an ugly burden. And as our brief exchange ended, I glanced past her shoulder into the cluttered living room where a toddler sat coloring. My rage inexplicably gave way to compassion. A few weeks later, Laura, I'll use that name, crossed the driveway to knock on my door this time. "You said you wanted to be a good neighbor," she said, looking at the floor. "Well, I've run out of grocery money for this week, and I'm wondering if you could lend me enough money to buy milk for my daughter. I can pay you back in a few days." Really? I wanted to say to God, is this a little much or something? But I found a $20 bill, and it wasn't long before Laura and I began talking over the fence about our neighborhood and her little girl, who I'll call Cassie. She repaid the milk money. The dogs start barking, and I came to know Laura as a bright and kind woman with a warm smile. Over time, I learned that she had been deeply wounded and that she struggled with mental illness, much like my own mother. She told me that she had one friend, and it was me. When her brother died of AIDS, Laura came to my house on the day of his funeral and asked if I would listen to her favorite song with her. She didn't want to do it alone. When the music ended, I was unsure of what to say, so I reached for her hand and asked if I could pray for her, and she nodded, teary-eyed. We were neighbors for 7 years before Laura and I moved to different parts of town. I attended her daughter's wedding, but eventually we lost touch. 2 weeks ago on Facebook, Laura's daughter said her mother was in the hospital and close to death. I called Cassie and asked if I could come. "Yes, please come," Cassie said. "You were her only friend. It would mean a lot." So I rushed to the hospital. When I walked into her room, Laura was still breathing, though her eyes were closed, and the doctors didn't know how much she could understand. Cassie told me that her mother had attempted suicide. I leaned over the bed, my face close to Laura's. "Laura, it's Peggy, your friend, and I'm here," I whispered. "You're not alone. I love you. God loves you." The silence reminded me of the day she and I sat in my house, listening to her brother's song. What words would comfort her now, I wondered. I pulled out my cell phone, Googled Bible verses for the dying, and began to whisper into the ear of my former enemy, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." And Laura's eyes opened briefly and then closed again. I could swear she knew I was there, but in truth, I'll never really know. What I do know is that as she died, Laura handed me a bittersweet gift. Years before we met, my mother, who also battled depression, had taken her life in the same way. She had lived across the country. I couldn't get to her in time to say goodbye. I never got to stroke my mother's hair or remind her that she was loved. Now, a woman I once called my enemy was freeing me from that long-held regret and sorrow. Laura died that night. I'll never forget her, nor the friendship that taught me that it's likely to take much more than a better political candidate, cable news show, or party platform to reverse the tide of hatred and revenge that is tearing this country apart. Maybe it will have to start with us, walking across the driveways that divide us and knocking on a door. Jesus said, I stand at your door and knock. So what about you? What about you? Let's pray. Jesus, we are here because you left the comfort of heaven, crossed the driveway of our universe, and came knocking on our door. Many of us are here because of a neighbor who loved us. And right now, we just want to confess that we often don't do this one simple but often sacrificial thing very well, and we need your help right now. Because we don't want to leave here the same. We want to commit right now to doing this one amazing thing that you called us to do, to love God by loving our neighbor. And so right now, we want to pause and not just pray for ourselves, but actually pray for our neighbors, for that family in crisis, for those kids we know they're watching their parents go through a divorce, for the marriage we know that's in trouble, for the drug and alcohol abuse that's going on behind closed doors often, for the families that are so often caught up in the game of accruing wealth and status and they don't even know it's killing them. Jesus, we pray that you would use us, you would use our church to start a revival in every neighborhood that we touch. We ask you to make that happen as we boldly go from here, throwing block parties and fixing toilets and celebrating birthdays and listening to stories, that somehow through your power and grace, your love could be experienced through ours. Even if it's just for that one person like Laura, we want to give our lives to that. Because one time, Jesus, you came knocking on our door, often through a neighbor. And may we go from this place and live the same. Help us do that and be with us as we do. We pray this in your name, Jesus. And everybody said, amen.